Your lecturer is Angus Fletcher. Dr. Fletcher is a professor of English and film at The Ohio State University and a core faculty member at Project Narrative. He holds a PhD in English from Yale University. Dr. Fletcher is the author of more than a dozen feature screenplays and television pilots. His academic research into story science has been funded by several organizations, including the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. Professor Fletcher has received teaching awards from Yale and the University of Southern California, and he was listed as one of Hollywood's top educators by Variety magazine.
Screenplays are, of course, the lowest form of art. Academy Award nominee John Milius referred to them as hack work. And then he changed his mind and called them garbage. And one of Casablanca's screenwriters remarked of his Oscar-winning script, "There wasn't one moment of reality in it. We weren't making art. We were making a living." So why would you want to learn about screenwriting when even the best screenwriters have cast aspersion on it? Over the next 30 minutes, I'll try to answer this question by showing you the value of studying screenplays. My name is Angus Fletcher, and I'm a full professor at Ohio State's Project Narrative, the world's leading academic think tank for the study of stories and how they work. And I'm also a screenwriter and a story consultant on Hollywood studio films and TV. So I've studied scripts from inside and out, and I'll share what I've learned about both the theory and the practice of screenwriting. I got my PhD from Yale in literature, but before that, my academic training was in neuroscience, and my current research at Project Narrative is in story science, where we collaborate with psychologists to use brain imaging and behavioral studies to explore how stories work in the mind. Science might not seem a natural way to understand an art like screenwriting, and when I started using neural scanners to analyze the effects of movie scripts, I did have a recurring nightmare that it would destroy the more magical aspects of storytelling, dead-ending in a grim dystopia where our creative imaginations were replaced by robotic algorithms. But as I hope you'll see over this course, neuroscience won't narrow or constrict your artistic vision. Quite the opposite. It will open up endless new creative space by tearing down some pseudoscientific myths that have stunted the study of screenwriting. To start with, neuroscience debunks the idea that there's a universal formula for all great scripts, or that all scripts follow the eternal pattern of the hero's journey. And it also sweeps away the theory that there are only 6 or 7 or 8 kinds of plot, or that all characters are based in timeless cognitive archetypes. In place of these oversimplifications, the empirical methods of modern neuroscience reveal a vast library of storytelling techniques that unlock endless possibilities for screenwriting, allowing you to experiment and innovate so that you don't just repeat the same plots over and over like a mindless superhero sequel. You do what your favorite scripts do and expand what people think and feel. To throw open these new horizons, we'll begin our lecture today by exploring 3 ways that studying scripts can change your life. Only one of them involves packing your bags and moving to Hollywood. The first life-changing thing you can learn from studying scripts is how to grow your storytelling powers. Because if you want to learn more about stories and the incredible things they can do, there's no better place to start than screenplays. Story is the core of every screenplay. And that's why 25 centuries ago, back when screenplays were stage plays, the Athenian polymath Aristotle observed that the plot of any script could be summed up in a few crisp sentences. If you needed more than that, either it wasn't a good story or you weren't a good storyteller. The same general rule holds true today. If you pitch screenplays professionally, you're expected to distill your 100-page scripts down into log lines of 20 words or less. Here's an 18-word logline for the Oscar-winning 12 Years a Slave. The true story of a man kidnapped into slavery who fights for over a decade to get home. Here's a shorter logline for My Big Fat Greek Wedding. A woman attempts to get her fanatically Greek family to accept her not-at-all Greek fiancé. And here's an even shorter logline for Rocky. A small-time boxer gets a shot to be the champion of the world. These core plots are so powerful that you can already feel the action of the film without a single actor or camera shot. The story alone is enough to move you. That story power is how outside-the-box films like 12 Years a Slave get made. And it's also what convinces studio execs to let total unknowns, like the writers of Rocky and My Big Fat Greek Wedding, act in their own scripts, becoming movie stars. The importance of story to screenplays is why many novelists and playwrights study screenplays. And you don't need high literary ambitions to benefit from honing your storytelling with screenplays. Because every one of us uses stories all the time in our ordinary lives to do extraordinary things. We use stories to bond with friends and family and even total strangers in private conversations or public toasts, or when tucking future generations into bed at night. We use stories in business to motivate our colleagues or inspire our clients. We use stories in politics to chart new futures for our democracy. And we even use stories to plot and replot our own lives, rewriting where we'll go tomorrow. That's because stories are perhaps the most powerful form of human communication. They contain information in action, and so they go beyond informing your audience. They move your audience, transporting and transforming them, touching their hearts and changing their minds. So by studying screenplays and learning their tricks, you can move your own audience more powerfully and intentionally. And by unearthing the massive diversity of Hollywood storytelling, you can find the screenwriting tricks that click perfectly with your own personal voice. So you don't tell stories in some soulless, mass-produced style. You tell your stories, like you, only even more irresistible and enchanting. So that's the first reason to study scripts, to sharpen your own storytelling. And here's the second reason, to deepen your appreciation of films and TV. We've all watched a film or a TV show with our friends or family that they love more than we do. And usually, most of us chalk that up to differences of taste and move on. But by accepting that certain stories just aren't for us, we let whole realms of human experience slip past, like a traveler who walks past the great monuments of the earth, but never steps inside. And why do that? Why not seize the opportunity to enjoy the most powerful films and television shows ever made? Why not journey into the extraordinary places they create? By learning how screenplays work, you can journey into these other worlds. You can plug into the action of any movie, connecting viscerally with it, in your heart and in your mind, so that you don't just watch the screen. You feel it move you, unlocking a fresh experience, connecting you to a new community, and expanding your sense of the big possibilities of life. So that's two reasons to study screenplays: to become a better storyteller and to appreciate film and television more deeply. Which leads us into the third and most obvious reason for studying scripts. And that's because you want to create one. Maybe you can't help yourself, and you've already fallen in love with the idea of writing a screenplay. After all, even if the only art to be found in most scripts is the art of compromise, there's still something curiously seductive about them. So magical is the dream of movie writing that it's even bewitched a few of the greatest literary talents in history. F. Scott Fitzgerald moved out to Hollywood after he wrote The Great Gatsby, confessing that he wanted to get some real status as a movie man and not a novelist. Such is the siren call of Hollywood fame and fortune. And it's not just an empty vanity. We've all watched enough bad movies to wish that someone would write a few more good ones. And if not you, well then who? This course is designed to help you gain all three of these benefits from studying scripts, because all three of them start from the same place. Whether you want to become a better storyteller, or enjoy more films and TV, or write screenplays yourself, the key is to begin by breaking down scripts to see how they work. Okay, so how do scripts work? What's the secret to an effective story? Well, to grasp the real secret, we need to begin by letting go of the widely peddled cliché that there's a universal set of formulas for all great stories. I've been lucky enough to work with 2 different Academy Award-nominated directors, and both of them had fundamentally different ideas of what made a good story, and both of them were right. That's because story structure is not a pre-programmed, eternal piece of neural hardware. It's better understood as a flexible form of software that our brains use to map the world and imagine different pathways through it. And since the world is tremendously big and forever changing, and since the possibilities for human action are open-ended and always increasing, our brains are capable of deploying an endless number of story forms and structures. So think of your brain as a computer that can run all sorts of story scripts. And by downloading different scripts from other people and places, or by inventing original story scripts of your own, you can program your brain to think and act in new ways. Like Neo in The Matrix, you can turn on your TV and become a different kind of hero you never dreamt of before. Or like Charlie Kaufman in Adaptation, you can sit down at your screenwriting desk and create a whole new heroism of your own. Once we see that stories are an agile and adaptive form of neural software, we free ourselves to discover all the ways that storytelling has changed and diversified over time. When the ancient Greeks told stories, they preferred characters who expressed one simple emotion. Homer's Iliad is about the anger of Achilles and how this one feeling led to a cascade of world-changing mayhem. We can still appreciate a character like Achilles today. The end of the Oscar-winning Unforgiven is an Achilles killing spree of unhinged fury. But since roughly the age of Shakespeare, we've also learned to tell stories about characters who feel 2 things at the same time. Like Hamlet, when he says, to be or not to be. And so, where Achilles became a legend for his consistent rage, Hamlet became a legend for his inconsistency, his reversals, and his indecision. This divergence between Hamlet and Achilles is just one example of the richness of storytelling methods. The world is filled with diverse cultures and traditions, and each of our individual brains works a little bit differently too. So there's an almost limitless number of right ways to tell a story. This diversity is exciting and liberating. But it also poses a major practical challenge, because if there isn't one master narrative for every good story, then how do you learn how to become a more effective storyteller? If the options for story are endless, then how do you find the right choice for you? Here's the real secret. To discover your own most effective stories, you use a technique known as reverse engineering. That might sound terrifying, but I promise it's not. The term reverse engineering is a modern coinage mostly used now by programmers and engineers, but it refers to a rhetorical technique that's been used to analyze scripts for thousands of years. It goes all the way back again to Aristotle, 2.5 millennia ago. In the Poetics, Aristotle gathered up the most popular scripts of his time, the dramatic tragedies of Athens, and he decided to figure out the nuts and bolts of how they worked. To do that, he started by observing that tragedies had a pair of cognitive effects on audiences. And those 2 cognitive effects were pity and fear. Aristotle then traced these 2 neural outcomes back to a specific plot event, called an anagnorisis, where a character has a tragic epiphany. Like the moment where Oedipus suddenly realizes that he's fulfilled the ancient prophecy that he's tried to escape all his life. The prophecy that he'll kill his father and sleep with his mother. Aristotle's analysis of Oedipus is our most ancient example of the simple 2-step process of reverse engineering. First, you identify the script's cognitive effect. And just to be clear what we mean by a cognitive effect, it's anything that happens in the brain. So emotions, feelings, moods, attitudes, perceptions, and all of these are cognitive, even though we sometimes refer to them colloquially as taking place in the heart or the imagination. Second, once you've identified the script's cognitive effect, you trace it back to the particular story structure in the script that causes that effect. So Aristotle identified two cognitive effects, fear and pity, and he traced them back to specific features of the plot. So step 1, isolate the cognitive effect. Step 2, isolate the unique story structure that causes it. That's reverse engineering. So is Aristotle's reverse engineer correct? Well, even though he drew up his blueprint for tragedy thousands of years ago, it fits tightly with what we now think about the neuroscience of pity and fear today. Modern psychologists generally view fear as the most powerful and ancient emotion in the brain, rooted deep in the primeval regions of our amygdala. And nothing stimulates our amygdala more strongly than human suffering we can't understand. Because if we can't fathom the source of someone else's suffering, we can't make a plan to avoid it ourselves. And so we feel in a constant state of danger. That's why horror movies, as we'll explore in our lecture on Jaws, are rooted in sharks and psychopaths and other things that our minds can't quite predict. That's why tyrants maintain their power by being arbitrary. And in the case of Greek tragedy, that's why Oedipus's suffering is rooted in the inscrutable turnings of fate. The tragic power of fate often goes underappreciated in the modern world because when we discuss fate, we usually try to analyze it philosophically, leading our conversations about Oedipus to devolve into debates about free will versus determinism. We try to figure out who's to blame for this tragedy. Is Oedipus really at fault? Is it the gods who are responsible instead? Or are even the gods in the grip of some malfeasant power that makes puppets of us all? But when we attempt this rationalization of Oedipus's doom, we ruin the primal mystery the Greek audiences felt in fate. Because the whole point of fate to the Greeks was that its workings could not be logically understood by human brains. Fate lay above us, in the heavens, beyond our mortal realm of comprehension. This raw incomprehensibility of fate is what makes the story of Oedipus so incredibly terrifying. Because when the original Greek audience saw Oedipus crushed by a mysterious power that they couldn't fathom or predict, their amygdalas went crazy, just like Aristotle's blueprint for tragedy suggests. So the first part of Aristotle's reverse engineer seems to work. The plot of Oedipus is specifically constructed to cause fear because it bases the suffering of its main character in an inscrutable force. So what about the other part of Aristotle's reverse engineer? Does the plot of Oedipus also trigger pity? Well, pity is a cognitive strain of empathy. And as we'll explore in our later lecture on character, psychology studies suggest that we generally feel empathy for someone when we see their deep fears exposed. And this exposing of Oedipus's fear is exactly what happens in the plot event that Aristotle pinpoints as anagnorisis. Here, Oedipus suddenly realizes that the inhuman power of fate applies to him, upending his arrogant king act and awakening his old terror about the prophecy. And as we in the audience see Oedipus collapse in fear and in trembling, our brains do what neuroscience predicts, and they respond by pitying him. So yes, it seems like Aristotle was right about the pity too. Not bad for a guy who lived 25 centuries before brain scanners were invented. And that's why Aristotle's method of reverse engineering stories is still going strong today. It's used by theorists, like the story scientists at Project Narrative, and by practitioners, like the screenwriters in the story labs of Steve Jobs' Pixar. So whether you want to analyze stories or create them, Aristotle's ancient method is still very much on the cutting edge. From a screenwriter's perspective, the value of reverse engineering is that it allows you to recreate the brilliant effects of your favorite scripts without literally plagiarizing them. If you copy the superficial details of your favorite script, you'll end up with a cheap knockoff. But if you use reverse engineering to go beneath the script's surface, you can discover its deeper creative logic, coming to understand why the author made the choices that she did. And once you understand why the author made the choices that she did, you can then tweak and adapt and extend those choices, making new creative decisions of your own. That's how Shakespeare managed to distinguish himself as more than a cheap hack. Shakespeare's first comedy, The Comedy of Errors, was a direct rip of the Roman playwright Plautus. And his first tragedy, Titus Andronicus, was plundered from the Roman playwright Seneca. But while Shakespeare was copying these authors, he was also using a version of reverse engineering that he learned from his rhetoric schoolbooks to uncover the deeper story logics beneath Roman comedy and tragedy, enabling Shakespeare to later do things like craft the gravedigger scene in Hamlet, which combines humor and horror in ways that the Romans never imagined. Reverse engineering will allow you to develop your own original voice in the same way. First, it gives you the freedom to choose your own storytelling models. Since the premise of reverse engineering is that there are endless ways to write a good story, it affords you endless freedom to decide what kinds of scripts you want to pickpocket. And second, reverse engineering helps you glimpse the deeper intentions of the authors that you rob, allowing you to do what those authors did and make your own unique story choices and innovations. Until hopefully, someday, you become the next Shakespeare that other writers steal from. So that's the power of reverse engineering. It's a scientific approach that doesn't limit your imaginative freedom. Instead, by helping you unearth an endless variety of storytelling blueprints, it opens up unlimited space for your own new creations. To help you learn how to use reverse engineering yourself, we'll explore it in further depth in our next lecture. Then, in the following 4 lectures on story world, character, tone, and plot, we'll explore the 4 main components that stories are engineered from. You'll notice that theme isn't one of those 4 components. That's because theme is not a part of stories. The whole idea of understanding stories in terms of themes dates back to Plato's efforts to discredit literature by subordinating it to philosophy, which we don't want to do here. Theme is the ghost in the machine. You can always superimpose it on stories if you want, but it doesn't have anything to do with the actual nuts and bolts of their operation, so I won't ever mention theme again. In our opening lectures, many of our examples of story world, plot, character, and tone will come from Greek and Shakespearean plays, from novels by Jane Austen and Mark Twain and Toni Morrison, from epic poems like the Iliad, and even from the Bible. This emphasis on novels, poetry, and theater might seem a surprising way to start a course on film and TV writing, but it reflects the fact that film and TV scripts are literary works whose origins lie in the most powerful and enduring literature of the past. And if you want to learn the fundamentals, the best place to go is to the source. To connect the literature of the past to the screenplays of the future, our opening lectures will also touch on over 20 Oscar-winning scripts. And from here, our next 12 lectures will offer detailed breakdowns of a dozen of the most legendary film scripts in history, from Casablanca to Star Wars, Toy Story to Fargo. As we'll see, each of these critically and commercially successful films has a different effect on our minds. So each of their scripts is engineered differently. Once you learn their special story components, you can then use these creations in your own writing. And you can also tweak or splice their blueprints to invent original experiences of your own, so you do what they did and innovate. Because the goal of these 12 examples isn't to limit you to 12 different ways of writing scripts. The goal is to teach you the method of reverse engineering so that you can unlock dozens or hundreds or thousands more movie experiences on your own, allowing you to appreciate or to create any kind of film script you can imagine. From here, our next 5 lectures will shift the focus from film to television, exploring some of the most celebrated TV scripts in history. We'll cover sitcoms like I Love Lucy, MASH, The Simpsons, and Broad City. We'll cover soaps like Grey's Anatomy, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and Mad Men. procedurals like Law and Order, House, and CSI, and dramas like Game of Thrones. As we'll see, TV writing is different in some crucial ways from writing for film. But once again, our method will not be to impose a universal formula for TV writing. It'll be to learn to use reverse engineering to open up an endless library of TV storytelling possibilities. We'll see how the most apparently formulaic TV shows, even procedurals like Law and Order and sitcoms like Seinfeld, are based on unique story engines, enabling you to build and enjoy endless story engines of your own. But before we get into all these scripts, let's end this lecture by talking about one practical thing you'll need to learn to start writing screenplays yourself. And that practical thing is formatting. The format of scripts can seem like a daunting technical exercise, but don't let it intimidate you. It's just a secret handshake for a club that went out of business years ago. Back in the days of the old studio system, there were a lot of hard and fast rules about formatting. The margins needed to be just so. 1 page of screenplay needed to translate exactly to 1 minute of screen time, and so on and so on. And that's because everyone at the studio spoke the same language. Every film was made by the same people, working on the same assembly line. But in the 1970s, that assembly line was broken apart. The talent agencies pulled the actors, the directors, and the writers out of studio contracts, and now story development, financing, and even production are increasingly done outside the studios. Occasionally, studios still develop, finance, produce, and distribute a movie from start to finish. But most of the time, they partner with outside producers and financiers. As a result, the rules for formatting have become looser. People aren't all trained by the same studio anymore. They come from different backgrounds, and they read for different things. Some read for budget, some read for story, some read for the characters, and so on. So don't worry too much about the Byzantine intricacies of formatting. Since your first script will almost certainly be read more for the story than for anything else, focus on communicating that story, not on getting your margins exact. But even so, there are a few basic rules that almost every script observes. And since I hope these lectures inspire you to start writing, let's touch briefly on those big rules. The first rule of formatting is to get yourself a screenwriting program. This will do most of the formatting automatically, saving you endless wasted time and effort. If you try to write a screenplay on a regular word processor, you'll be shortening your life. Don't do it. If you just want to throw away your time on Earth, take up free climbing or something more stimulating. There are free screenwriting programs you can download from Google Docs and Trelby. If you want the industry standard for screenwriting programs, it's Final Draft. Everybody uses it, and it's extremely intuitive. Now let's talk about writing a scene. Each scene begins with a slug line, and each slug line has 3 main parts. The first part of the slug line is EXT, for exterior, if the scene is outside, or INT, for interior, if it's inside, or sometimes EXT/INT if it shifts between the two. The second part of the slug line is the physical location, like Andy's bedroom, or Fargo, North Dakota. The final part of the slug line is the time mark, often day or night, to let the crew know whether they need to prep the set for noon or midnight. But the time mark can also be CONT, for continuous, if it follows immediately after the scene before. And it can also be moments later, or minutes later, or next day, if that's the best way to communicate the time at which it happens. After the slug line, there are 2 big types of script content. The first kind of content is scene descriptions, or action beats, like a row of moving boxes lie on the floor, or a car bursts through the curtain of snow. Action is always in the present tense, and you can use caps to highlight important beats or objects in the action or descriptions. A car bursts through the curtain of snow. Just don't overdo it with the caps. It's like shouting. People pay more attention when you do it selectively. The second type of script content is dialogue. If you're using Final Draft to enter dialogue, just hit Tab. The first dialogue component you'll enter is the character's name, in caps. Then hit a hard return and enter their words. If you want to insert an action in the dialogue, hit Tab after the character's name, and it'll give you a parenthesis. In general, don't explain what the camera does. That's the director's job. Your job is to describe the scene with enough visual flair that the director can see what the camera should see without you being explicit about it. We'll talk more about how to do that in our lecture on tone. To begin your script, you can write fade in, or cold open, or over black, if you want sounds or dialogue to come in first. Or you can just start without any of those directions, allowing the director to make the call. Because hey, directors always like to make the call. If you have more technical formatting questions, study a few of your favorite screenplays and crib from them. If you can't find an answer to your formatting question in these screenplays, the chances are it's not that big a deal. So just do whatever makes most sense to you. As long as you're not printing your script on scented paper or in multicolored ink, people will read the first page. And if they like the first page, they'll read the second page. Because really, people in the industry just want to know, do you have a good story to tell? A story that grabs them, a story that they haven't seen before. If you do, they can fix the formatting. If you'd like to practice formatting, here's a couple exercises you can try. First, get a copy of one of your favorite scripts. Then retype their opening scene in Final Draft or your own screenwriting program to get a feel for how the format works. Second, without consulting the official script and instead simply rewatching part of the final film on screen, type up another scene. Then compare it with the original script and see how the two compare. There's a lot about scripts and about storytelling to learn. And so sometimes in the following lectures, I might talk with a heightened velocity to get it all in. But I just want you to get all the big knowledge you need. For the remainder of these lectures, I'll be addressing you like you want to be a screenwriter, because the most effective way to learn to better appreciate films or to tell better stories is to think like a screenwriter. But in the final lecture, I'll circle back and talk specifically about how everything in this course can be applied to improve your film appreciation and your storytelling. So if you ever feel bogged down in the nitty-gritty of screenwriting and you want more on enjoying TV or honing your stories, skip ahead to the final lecture to put it all in perspective. Because, as always with reverse engineering, whenever things seem murky or mysterious, the way to find your answer is to turn to the end and work back from there.